Imperial Yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kveik hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Brewing beer can sometimes seem like a slow process, with brew days taking up most of the day, and then 2 weeks of fermentation, then carbonation and packaging. If you're lucky, your beer is in the glass within 2 weeks, but in many cases it takes a month or longer to fully mature. How do you know when it's ready, and what is this concept of beer maturation? I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode, Beer Maturation, with John Palmer.
This one really scratched the itch for me because I think of the current contributors, I'm probably the slowest brewer. I'll do long step mashes, even decoction. I'm cold fermenting my lagers. I'm lagering lagers for 2 or 3 months. And so I'm a big believer in slow beer. And I thought John Palmer did a great job of kind of laying out some of the science as to why that might matter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was so much to learn from last week's episode. I mean, John, first of all, just has an incredible amount of brewing wisdom and experience. I mean, again, he wrote the book on at least home brewing, right? We covered a whole bunch of material, like what happens after attenuation, right? Attenuation sounds like this super fancy scientific word, which we'll get into here in a little bit. But why? Also, like looking at why do we let beer mature before packaging? What are tips and tricks for making sure the beer is ready, and what's actually happening during this maturation step? I always joke that there's no beer timer that like rings right when the beer is done. And it was a lot of information, and this is a topic that Jordan and I certainly have strong opinions about. So this should be fun as we apply the science in this episode. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons, and as a reward for your support, you get awesome things like access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is super easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time, but if you're out there listening to this show and reading the content and listening to the Brülosophy podcast and watching the Brülosophy show, there's no end to content, and it's all for free. And also, if you're looking for that perfect gift for a home brewer, hey, maybe consider signing someone up as a patron, or requesting to your spouse or significant other to give you the Patreon benefit for Christmas. Always something to think about. If you need more information, check it out at at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another great way to support us is by using the links at brülosophy.com/support. And it's that time of year again when we're making holiday season purchases. And as you do that, start your shopping experience by using those links to our partners. They give us a small kickback if you purchase something through them, and it doesn't change your shopping experience. Every little bit helps us. So please visit brülosophy.com/support to see if any of your holiday shopping vendors are listed. This week's feedback is brought to you by the innovative team at Haas, who recently announced Lupomax, a hop product with a consistent concentration of lupulin for optimized hop flavor that allows brewers to use upwards of 30% less hops to achieve similar results as T90 pellets, thus increasing yield without compromising beer quality. Available in a wide range of varieties, including Amarillo, Azaka, Brew One, Cascade, Cashmere, Centennial, Chinook, Citra, Columbus, Equinox, Eldorado, Idaho 7, McKinsey, Mosaic, Sots, Sabro, and Talus. All of us here at Brülosophy love Lupomax, and the reviews from others are equally as positive. Learn more about Lupomax and all the other amazing stuff that Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, feedback this week actually comes from a comment on a recent Brülosophy show episode. It was the one about brewing beer with Gatorade, which, by the way, if you are not watching the Brülosophy show, you are totally missing out. It's fantastic content, and Martin does an amazing job. And in this episode, he actually brewed a beer with Gatorade. But somebody was asking in sort of the comments on the show, hey, what's a good podcast to listen to if we want more information about science behind brewing? And the commenter at Orange Microfiber 974 4 replied and said, regarding the Brew Lab, I tried to listen once, but there was literally 5 minutes of ads at the start. I get that ads support it, but that's way too much and way too soon. So of course, Marshall, our producer and editor, responded. He said, hi there, as producer and editor of the Brew Lab, I can assure you it has only a single 30-second pre-roll ad from Imperial Yeast, which is very intentional. If you actually heard 5 minutes of ad prior to that, the only thing I can think of is that your particular podcast server is placing them for their own profit, which I believe is illegal. Please do reach out if you ever run into a similar issue, as I'll be sure to nip it in the bud immediately. But like you said, advertising is a necessary evil, even though we promote companies and products we actually believe in that allows us to keep producing the show. We do our best to keep everything balanced, hence my concern about others interjecting their own into our podcast. Cheers. So yeah, I mean, ads are a thing, right? I mean, it's what helps us support the podcast. Becoming a patron only takes it so far. And we try to do as good of a job as we can in not overwhelming you with ads. But if you're hearing things like that, just please let us know. I mean, it's always stuff that we need to hear about. And if you think the ads are too big or too long at the front, I'm happy to get that feedback too. Let me know and we'll see what we can do. If you've got ideas for intro content that we could do in this first segment, that's also good too. What do you think, Jordan? Ads?
Well, no one likes an ad, but I will say that I kind of appreciate the brewing ads that we do get on this show and that other brewing podcasts provide, because that's how I found out about a lot of cool products, right? Mm-hmm. And so I wouldn't have known about Lupomax if it wasn't for Brülosophy ads, right? And so the majority of our ads are brewing content, and it is kind of a cool way to learn about stuff you might not have known about otherwise.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, we do have some ads that are not brewing related, that are syndicated ads. But most of our content is brewing related. I mean, of course, Imperial, Haas, Clawhammer, Brewfather, all of those stuff are great and awesome tools for home brewers. So yeah, anyway, thank you, listener, for that comment. And like I said, if you've got things that you want to see differently about the show, shoot me an email. It's great to get it onto the feedback. All right, after this short break, we'll be talking about beer maturation. We'll be right back. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. When I first started my job as a cellar person at Blue Owl, Jeff, the president and head brewer, told me that his favorite place in the brewery was in the cellar. We joked that for most modern breweries, the brewing in the brew house is largely just pushing buttons and cleaning out the mash tun. But it's obviously more than that. But the cellar is where you get to watch the beer grow. And you're largely the person that's responsible for saying, okay, this beer is done. It's kind of a blend of science and art. And I don't know, that's my favorite place in the brew house, is like checking the fermentations, making sure that the beer tastes good, troubleshooting, fining, putting those last finishing touches on the beer. What about you, Jordan?
I actually just spent a day in the cellar. I did a ton of cellar work today in my home brewery, and I thought it was a wonderful, relaxing day. It's a heck of a lot less stressful than an actual hot side brew day, I'll say that. But oh my gosh, it matters so much. You could make the most amazing beer throwing hundreds of dollars of hops into it, even at the homebrew level. But then if you oxidize it or, pitch a bad pitch of yeast because you didn't take care of it properly, it's all for naught. And so the cellar work is so incredibly important. And I think that that's like where a lot of the maturation work comes into play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and just from my experience at Blue Owl, and don't get me wrong, I mean, brewers in the brew house are doing a lot of work too, right? I mean, they're sending the sweet wort over into the brew house for the fermentation, and then we're monitoring the fermentation. And we always say, right? I've said this a bunch of times on the show too, that yeast makes beer, brewers make wort, right? Right. So really, the cellar is a bunch of yeast management and yeast wrangling, and that's kind of what we talked about with John, which I thought was pretty interesting. So I mean, we all know, okay, you make wort, and then that gets transferred over into a fermenter. You pitch yeast, and then yeast does all the hard work from there. But one of the things that was really important to me about this episode on maturation is all of the hard work things that the yeast does. I mean, we think we're pitching yeast so that we can get alcohol and CO2, right? I mean, those are the fermentation byproducts. If you look at the chemistry, the actual just pure chemistry of consuming sugar, yeast spits out alcohol and CO2. But yeast is also a living organism. It's doing things, right? And it's not just spitting out alcohol and CO2. In fact, it doesn't even care. I love that John said that, right? Like the yeast doesn't give a crap about the alcohol and CO2. In fact, it just wants to grow and reproduce and build celled walls and build daughter cells and all this other stuff. I mean, yeast is living its life. So for us as brewers to think that like, oh, the fermentation process is just alcohol and CO2, to me, I would love to hear John say that. It's like, okay, there is more to this than just that part.
Right. And in fact, alcohol and CO2 are toxic to yeast. And so it's kind of an unfortunate byproduct for that organism. But it's, as a brewer, we need to give it the right conditions for it to make a beer that's going to be a pleasurable experience. Because as we know, like you've said in other episodes, like Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. And
Yep.
this is why we can get Brettanomyces contaminations in otherwise clean beer, because a single cell could, catch on and start multiplying and have some problems. And so if you're just pitching, a couple sprinkles of dry yeast, you might get a fermentation, but it's going to be so stressed that it's not going to make a good product. And so that's why it's really important for us to do the things to make a healthy fermentation so it has the necessary kind of resume to push forward into the maturation phase. One thing that I've experienced in a lot of newer homebrewers taking a stab at lager for one of the first time or two is that you'll get acetaldehyde in that finished lager, even if there's not diacetyl present. And obviously temperature is an interactive variable here, but generally speaking, if you're cold fermenting a lager and you underpitch it, you run the risk of acetaldehyde, because it's like John explains, there's just not enough time for it to, not enough time, but enough, cell mass and et cetera, to effectively clean that up after it's done. And like he describes in that last episode, there's some interesting kind of chemistry reasons behind that. And what was the analogy he gave? Like a busy day at the office, If you don't have the proper time or the proper tools, in this case, like sufficient, yeast mass, they might just kind of like knock off early for the day, as it were, after the attenuation is complete, and then fail to clean that stuff up on the back end.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I loved that analogy, first of all, where he's talking about like, you got all this paper stacked up on your desk, right? And you can either do it really fast and like under a lot of stress, or you can have like a nice constant flow of paper, and then have everything nice and clean and your desk all straightened up, ready for the next day. I love that. And that was kind of one of the big takeaways, again, for me from the show, was when I was kind of, prepping the notes for this and thinking about beer maturation. And I wasn't thinking about the things that you need to do to set the stage for maturation to occur, right? And again, that's a huge takeaway that like you were just talking about. But for me, that was just such a big part of what John said.
Right. And so I think that we need to be mindful of sanitation, pitch rate, oxygenation, yeast nutrient, fermentation temperature. As we've discussed a lot in this podcast, and as we've seen in a lot of experiments, a lot of this stuff is kind of insurance. You might be able to get away without oxygenating your wort. We know that a fresh pack of yeast, or a fresh pack of dry yeast for that matter, might not need it. But it's if you have the oxygen wand, it's pretty darn easy to stick it in for a minute, And so it's little things like that. That's kind of my whole brewing ethos is, why take the risk if it's easy enough and cheap enough, I'm just going to do it. And because I want to set the stage for the best beer possible. And skipping steps, it runs a risk, and it's not going to burn you every time. And so that's what I think John's really reinforcing is take it slow, take it easy, follow the proper steps if you want to ensure the best possible outcome in terms of risk versus a reward.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways I was thinking about it whenever I was, prepping for the show and then talking to John about it was this attenuation versus maturation. And John was kind of setting up that as well, from a information, standpoint, right? Like attenuation is this part where we're taking the sugars and then turning that into alcohol and CO2. And attenuation finishes when there's no more reduction of sugars, right? And then maturation starts to happen. And he was sort of saying attenuation versus maturation, again, to illustrate a point that there are two steps to this. But again, one of my big takeaways is that yeast has to do attenuation and maturation. So like you said, you have to have sanitation. You have to have the right pitch counts, right? Pitch rate is a big deal. Oxygen for your wort, because again, even though I have an experiment on olive oil, using olive oil to supplement, as Lance Shaner from Omega said on that episode, a while back, yeast still needs oxygen to make ergosterol, which is a cell wall product. So it can't bud and it can't grow unless it has sufficient oxygen. So you have to give it all of these things. And I think I even asked John this question, right? I talked about his 5 priorities from Homebrew, or from How to Brew, his book. And he said one of the maturation fits in this in yeast health, yeast management, sanitation. I mean, all of these things are about not just having a good full attenuation, but also cleaning up the diacetyl, the acetaldehyde, any of the other secondary metabolites that yeast is going to take up and get rid of, maybe lower sulfur production, right? So you don't have to deal with sulfur during maturation. If the yeast isn't stressed, it's not going to produce as much sulfur. That's a big problem for a bunch of those lager yeasts, right? They get highly stressed and they throw a bunch of sulfur, and then that sulfur smells like an egg fart, and nobody wants to drink that, right? And so I feel like that was just a really cool aspect of that. And again, it's I don't know that it's necessarily like a new way for me to think about fermentation and attenuation and maturation, but it really sort of drives home the beer is not done when the sugars are no longer being consumed, right? It's after that it happens. And when you say it like that, everybody goes, well, duh, because I got to wait for diacetyl to go away and I got to wait for acetaldehyde. I mean, anybody that's brewed beer and has ever made a diacetyl bomb and an acetaldehyde bomb knows exactly what we're talking about, right? And one other point I wanted to make about this show was I'm using a word attenuation and maturation, but those are just kind of like scientific words for what every brewer already knows, right? We're measuring the gravity, and when the gravity stops going down, attenuation is done. Maturation is when it no longer tastes like butter or green apple or raw pumpkin or whatever, and it starts to taste like beer, and it's really good, crisp, clean beer. Maturation is done, right? And I think so. That was one key question that I asked John too. Is how do you know when the beer is done? When has it completed maturation? And John gave his answer. What do you think, Jordan? What's your take on when is a beer done?
I think that when it tastes right, and that is kind of tough, and it comes with experience, because if you're brewing your first beer, you might not know that the acetaldehyde flavor is, quote, an off flavor, right? And obviously one man's off flavor is another person's, treasure, but that's a different debate. But I think that really it comes down to taste. And I think that's what he says in the episode, right? Is that pro brewers, they're doing tongue-based sensory to figure out when something's actually done.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. It's sensory that's determining this, and I mean, even John mentioned too, right? Like you're going to taste your beer, and I guess like you said, it's kind of experience. When I taste this beer and it tastes clean and crisp and really and ready to go, then I know it's done. And there are some things that you can do, right? I mean, John mentioned after fermentation, you're going to want to wait at least a few days for diacetyl to get cleaned up and acetaldehyde to finish, right? Acetaldehyde might already be finishing mostly during fermentation because the yeast is going to start excreting that enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde into ethanol, right? But it can go backwards. It can go ethanol to acetaldehyde if you have an infection or if you have other issues. But anyway, I digress. Right. Most of the time, there's not going to be a whole lot of acetaldehyde because that acetaldehyde is getting broken down into ethanol. And so you're making alcohol from that. But diacetyl is a big problem, right? And if you've ever just bottled a beer, as soon as the fermentation stops, you've had a diacetyl bomb. Or if you've tried to dry hop in a bottle, you've got a diacetyl bomb. Any of those things. And diacetyl is a big deal. But one other comment that you made, Jordan, just now is the importance of sensory on this, right? If you don't know what diacetyl tastes like, or if you don't know what acetaldehyde tastes like, it's really hard to know when your beer is done. And I'm a huge advocate. Please, if you haven't done it yet, please do an off-flavor training because they're so important and so useful as a brewer.
Well, and not to mention, we all have different sensory perception thresholds. And there are people that I have a brewer buddy, he can't taste diacetyl. And so he has his wife, who is sensitive to it, do the sensory for him to make sure his lagers have passed VDK. Acetaldehyde, I did a flavor standard experience a couple times, and that one doesn't bother me that much. It didn't have that intense of an No, I'm sorry. It was DMS. DMS, it didn't really bother me that much, the flavor standard. So maybe I have like a higher sensory threshold. And so I think that's why a good brewery isn't just having one person do this. You have a range of palates because, not to mention palate fatigue, it really helps to have some people to help to kind of taste through these things. And so if you're a home brewer, have a buddy, have your wife, have your brother, have someone help you out because it's easy to even kind of get stuck with like ugly baby syndrome. And it's like, oh, it's so good. It's like, dude, there's a lot of D in this.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's a lot of DMS again, I've told this story before, but I remember it was my second beer and it was not great. My second beer was not objectively, it wasn't bad, but it was a dumper. Objectively, and I served it to one of my friends, and he took one sip of it, and he goes, "Yeah, not my style." And I just really appreciate that feedback because it was like, okay, yeah, all right, this is not a great beer. I actually need to work on this, And I struggle a lot with acetaldehyde and DMS. I don't pick them up strongly, especially at their thresholds. Diacetyl, I can smell across the room. I'm super sensitive to it, and I don't know why, but acetaldehyde, DMS, and my arch nemesis is sulfur. I don't know what happens. I am totally anosmic to sulfur. It does not. People will be like, "Oh God, I can't drink this beer. It smells like a skunk," or "Oh, it smells like egg farts," and I'm just like, "Hey, it tastes great. Tastes like Heineken or something," But yeah.
Well, let's talk about sulfur for a second as a launch pad too. We talked about how maturation is a function of yeast finishing the job, and that's true. But there's a second thing that happens with maturation, which is kind of like a natural volatilization or falling out of certain unsavory things. And I think sulfur is a good example of that. As far as I understand, sulfur dispersion following a lager fermentation isn't so much of a function of yeast reabsorbing it, right? It's that it just kind of dissipates off over time. And that's why a sulfury beer following attenuation needs that extended lagering time for sulfur to volatilize out. Now, there are some tricks, and we'll talk, I think, more in the second half about ways to kind of like expedite some of these traditional longer time frame maturation processes. But a beer, certain styles especially, needs some time just for things to kind of fall out, like hop burn, get the little hop particulates to fall out of solution. Yeast to fall out of solution so your beer isn't murky, provided you want a relatively clear beer. There's a lot of things that happen that just a little bit of extra time helps some of that. It kind of rounds out the edges. When you taste a beer, be it an IPA or, a cream ale, the day that you're transferring off the yeast, it's not quite the same experience than just a week later.
Mm-hmm. Totally, right? And on the flip side, right, when people are talking about IPAs, and again, we'll get into this in the second half, we're going to split it up by styles, but when people are talking about IPAs, an IPA that's sat for a month is maybe undrinkable. It sort of depends on what you've done in fermentation and in packaging and all that sort of stuff. But, sort of getting back to this question, like you were talking about, is like, how do I know when the beer is done? It's whenever, to me, again, it's sensory, right? It's whenever there's no diacetyl, when there's no acetaldehyde, when there's nothing else that is an off flavor to beer. And unfortunately, part of that is experience. And so one of the questions that I asked John is like, what sorts of measurements can you take, throughout fermentation to know that that you are at, your beer is mature and it's ready to go, right? I mean, of course, we can do attenuation. We're measuring gravities, and we know when the gravity stops and it sits down there at the, it'll still have some residual sugar in the beer. But whenever the residual sugar stops going down, when it levels out, that's whenever you've reached attenuation. And then John said, hey, like a general rule of thumb is a couple days after that, most of the diacetyl and everything's going to be picked up, taste the beer, and if it tastes good, done, right? But I'm wondering, like, are there any other measurements that you take throughout fermentation to check and see, like, when the beer is done?
Well, definitely want to give a shout out to the digital floating hydrometers of the world. I've been using Tilt for years. I just picked up my first Keglin wrapped pill. And that's a really great way to measure attenuation throughout the life cycle of the beer. I don't have it set up to ping and constantly collect measurements. I'm starting to figure that out with the wrapped pill from Kegland. But the Tilt, I've just always looked on the app and just it's kind of fun to just look every day. How's it doing? And it's really nice to be able to take constant fermentation attenuation measurements without taking samples of the beer. I ferment in kegs, so I can easily get O2 free samples via CO2 on the gas in post, and then put a party tap on the beer out post and can pull a sample without exposing it to any oxygen. But yeah, it's really nice to not waste the beer. I'm only making 4.5, 5 gallons at a time. And if you're taking a half pint daily to check the attenuation, there's not going to be that much beer left after a couple weeks. And so that's one thing I'm definitely paying attention to is attenuation. And we'll talk more about ALDC in the second half, but I'm kind of using it as a standard practice at this point. So, in a world where I wasn't using ALDC, I would also want to do a VDK test, especially for lagers, and make sure that I'm not tasting any diacetyl. We've talked about that on this show before, but basically you have a control sample, which is straight from the fermenter, and then you have a treatment sample that you heat up and you cool back down, and then you see if you can taste or smell diacetyl in either sample. If you're tasting it in both, it's definitely not ready. If you're only tasting it in the heated and cooled sample, there's still some left, and you run the risk of those VDKs converting to diacetyl via oxidation, which can happen when you go into package. So those are really the only things I'm really paying that much attention to. I've checked pH before in the past, but my SOPs have kind of gotten to the point where my pH has been pretty good. So really, it's just kind of like a vibe,
Yeah.
Like you just know, okay, attenuation's passed, tasting pretty good. I think I'm ready to move on to the next stage.
Yeah, right. Attenuation's passed, it's tasting very good, but that VDK measurement is important. And, this is a key too, right? Nobody, and I think even most commercial brewers aren't running their beer through any sort of like a scientific instrument, right? They're not. I mean, there are ways to do this, and there are some breweries I know that are running VDK measurements like actually through a machine to make sure that VDKs are done. But most breweries, at least in the United States, are doing exactly what Jordan just said: a control sample that's straight from the fermenter, and then a heated and cooled sample. So, and I mean, you heat it up to like 100 degrees or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe like 37, 38 degrees Celsius. Heat it up and then cool it back down. Heat it up for like 30 minutes and then cool it back down to, beer drinking temperatures, room temperature. And that'll be enough for the diacetyl to come out. So that the diacetyl actually converts just it's a chemical reaction. So it's not based on like yeast metabolism or anything else. It's just a chemical reaction. And if there's alpha acetolactate in there, it'll convert into diacetyl, and that diacetyl will then taste like butter, right? And you'll have buttered popcorn in your beer. So like you, I'm doing the same sorts of measurements. I'm doing measuring my attenuation using gravities. For a long time, I was using a refractometer, and I still like using the refractometer because you only need a couple of drops of wort. I really like that. But like you, I'm kind of waiting until my fermentations I know are mostly mostly done, and that'll depend on the style, which we'll get to in a minute. But after that, I'm doing a VDK test to test it and make sure it actually sends out, that it actually comes up, sensorily not tasting like butter. But I'm really not doing any other measurements after fermentation. And that's kind of a key for me here too, is that like, even though maturation is happening, there's like a level of nuance to maturation. It's not like one size fits all. It's not like, you mash in at 154 and you make, an ale, or like you pitch it with, ferment at 66 and you're going to have esters or whatever. It's not like these sort of rules. It's kind of like, when the beer tastes good, it's done. And like the scientist part of me sort of like hates that, because it's like, I want some sort of objective measurement that says like, okay, there's no more VDK, there's no more acetaldehyde, the beer is ready, it's gone ding. I have this scientific measurement, but that's really not the case. And that's one of the things I love about brewing, is it's like equal parts art and science. There is an artistry to when the beer is done, and it isn't always the fastest possible time, right? I mean, I think you, Jordan, are like the best, certainly of the Brülosophy contributors. You're the one that's like most committed to like, no, I'm giving this time. I'm not going to drink it right now, even though I know there's experiment or whatever, and it can say whatever it wants, but I am not doing that. I'm giving it time.
Yeah, I'm a rule follower when it comes to brewing, and it served me well. But, it's tasting stuff to see if it's ready is also kind of hard, because it's not necessarily cold, it's not carbonated, and it's not cold matured yet, right? And obviously tasting your lager that's been lagering for 2 months and is already carbonated and is already clear, that's beer at that point, right? And so that's like pretty easy to taste, like, oh yeah, that's hitting, let's tap this. But a warm IPA sample that was pitched 8 days ago that stopped fermenting, it's like tastes kind of weird. And I'll taste IPAs prior to dry hop, and it's like, I hope this is going to be good, because it just doesn't taste the same yet. And then if you taste it following dry hop, but prior to like that kind of cold maturation phase in between dry hop and consumption, it's rough. There's still particulates in solution. They're getting on your tongue. And so tasting quasi-finished beer is a bit of an art, because it does not taste like the finished beer ultimately will.
Mm-hmm. Another thing too, that like the taste, the burn, the hop burn is there. If you want to know what acetaldehyde tastes like, taste your beer on day 2 of fermentation. That's what acetaldehyde tastes like, because it's like there's like so much acetaldehyde there that's been produced. That'll give you an example of what that tastes like. But if you ferment in glass carboys, you can actually also watch maturation happen, because during fermentation things are moving around. And this is one of the laments I have for stainless steel. I love my stainless steel. It's so easy to clean, and I would never trade it for a glass carboy. I wouldn't. But it's fun to just watch the fermentation happen, watch the krausen build up, watch the bubbles, and the roiling inside of the fermentation. And then when the beer's done, watching everything settle out, right? Watching the beer clarify like in front of your eyes, especially if you're using gelatin or some other sort of finings, just watching it clear up. All this gunk settles out and settles down to the bottom. Like you said, with IPAs and with hops, you're adding all of this hop material in there, and that stuff will settle out and get out of the beer. But it's not happening during active fermentation, because the gas that's being produced is causing these effects that make the beer mix, right? Fermentation is rigorous. It happens. It's a bunch of things bumping together and colliding and all this stuff. That's why we get such good attenuation with a lot of yeast, is because, they encourage this volatile environment where things can bump together and have reactions, and yeast can get the nutrients that it needs and all that sort of stuff. So I love watching the actual visual of fermentation settling and finishing, of maturation happening in a glass carboy. So those of you that are able to do that and watch it, that's a pretty cool thing. But this also was one last question before we go to the break. And I asked this of John, this whole question of racking from the primary fermenter to the secondary fermenter, because, and I'm pretty sure if you read How to Brew, it will say rack to a secondary, but certainly one of the other books was Charlie Papazian's Joy of Homebrewing. That's one of the other older books that people used to always read. And that one certainly says rack to a secondary for maturation, right? So when fermentation is finished, when you've reached that final attenuation, you're going to rack it to a secondary, to a different vessel, and let it sit there to mature. And I don't do that anymore at all, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on racking to a secondary.
Well, first off, I do believe that Palmer has released subsequent editions of the book, and my guess is like edition 7 or whatever we're on at this point probably no longer recommends that, because I think he is updating it. And then, the Joy of Homebrewing, the complete Joy of Homebrewing, that was written in like the 70s or something. I was at a
well, yeah, originally in the 80s or 90s or something, but that did get updated too into like the early 2000s.
Right. But I was going to say, I was at an Airbnb and I found an original copy on the bookshelf there, and it was cool to flip through it. And it's like, take the can of malt extract and take the yeast from the bottom and, open that. And it's like giving you instructions on pre-hopped cans of syrups and stuff. It was a totally different world, and racking to secondary at the time was, the practice. And I think that you guys talked about this in the last episode, that was this a carryover from the wine world, or was this maybe necessary with the quality of the yeast at the time? But yes, I think that that has pretty much gone away at this point. No one's racking to secondary. Part of it is that when this was common knowledge, we weren't doing oxygen-free transfers as a homebrewing at the community at the time. And so that is a huge, obviously the risk of oxidation is way bigger concern than whatever could theoretically happen by not doing a secondary. But lagering is effectively a secondary. And there are mixed fermentation approaches that do use a secondary. And so I think that there are, not to mention if you're fruiting a beer, that's a secondary fermentation. Bottling is technically a secondary fermentation. So there are modern approaches to secondary that are still employed. But in terms of a standard ale, no one's doing that anymore. And if you are, stop.
If you are, stop. Yeah, and I want to be clear too, regardless of what it said in How to Brew whenever I first read it or anything, John was very clear in this episode, right, of the podcast saying like, no, you don't need to do a secondary fermentation in a standard ale. And again, like you said, we talked about this like history of, the carryover of racking from a primary to a secondary and all that. So I want to be very clear. John was very, very much in favor of primary fermentation and then waiting until the beer is done and then going ahead and packaging it. All right. Well, there's another piece of this that John and I talked about, and one that I think Jordan and I especially have a lot of opinions about, and that's the stylistic impact of beer maturation. Certain styles mature at different rates, and there are different things that you need to do with different styles. So we'll talk about those things after this short break.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
As soon as I brew a beer, I'm ready to drink it. I'm impatient, all right? I spent all this time, I spent all day, slaving over a hot kettle, and I added my hop additions, and I did all this recipe design. I've got the beer in the fermenter. I would like to drink it now, right? I think everybody has the same experience, or at least I hope you do, right? You spend all this time brewing the beer. It took 6 hours or 7 or 8 hours of your day, or 2 hours if you're Marshall and doing short and shotties, but it takes all this time. I want to drink it like today. And when I'm baking or cooking, I get to cook and spend all this time prepping and cook, and I can usually eat that thing the day that I make it. It's hard to wait 2 weeks or a year. But I feel like with beer, if I drank the beer the day that I brewed it, I wouldn't like it. So I think I'm willing to be a little bit more patient than I used to be.
Well, I would hope you waited till it was fermented, otherwise it's a different beverage. But I mean, before I had a dedicated lagering chamber, I had this real problem because I was lagering in the kegerator and I wasn't brewing a ton of beer when I was getting into lagers. And so basically I would be drinking the lager to see if it was ready. And by the time it was actually lagered and matured and ready to drink, it was about the last pint.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it's so like I'm impatient, but as I get older, I learn to appreciate the journey as well, right? And I'm sure you the same. You learn to appreciate the journey, and so part of what we were talking about in the last segment is like there's this attenuation phase, and then there's maturation. There's the alcohol, the turning sugar into alcohol and CO2 phase, and then there's the cleaning up the beer and making it drinkable phase. That's different based on the beer that you're brewing, right? And so I think we should start off first. Then we're going to spend this segment talking about different styles of beer, like ales, lagers, strong beers, sours, all that sort of stuff. But I think we need to start with like traditional regular ale, right? If you're just brewing an ale, what do you do, Jordan? And how do you know that the beer is ready?
Yeah, I think that traditional ale that's fermented warm-ish, and I guess when we say traditional ale, we're talking English ales, American ales, not Belgian ales. I think that if you're fermenting a blonde ale at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't need that much time. Now, if you're using an English strain that throws a lot of diacetyl, and you're English mild or something, you do need to be paying attention to diacetyl rest and stuff like that. But generally speaking, these American neutral ale strains at a standard, mid 60s fermentation temperature and a standard, 1050-ish OG, it doesn't need that much time. And the fermentation temperature that we're fermenting it at is effectively reducing the little diacetyl that it would create in the first place with these kind of known non-diacetyl producing strains. You're at the right temperature to clean that up if it was to make any, as well as acetaldehyde. So those, I think, are the quickest beers to pump out, Kvik aside. They seem to be they kind of do what they need to do in a shorter amount of time than some of the other styles that we might brew.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's a little bit that has to do with the fermentation temperature, but also just the yeast that's been selected over the hundreds of years of brewing, right? I mean, this ale yeast has been selected to do this job. And, we talked about it in other episodes about like the evolutionary morphology of yeast. It developed this Crabtree effect, which allows it to ferment really quickly, which makes it prefer fermentation over respiration in the presence of sugar. It's developed a whole genome duplication, a whole bunch of other things. I'm not going to go into all of that right now, but yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is incredibly fast at fermenting, and it's been harvested to do this job quickly. Maybe because most brewers are like me and they're impatient, right? They're just like, hey, that yeast was done in 4 days. This year, yeast was done in 3 weeks. Let's use the one that's finished in 4 days, not the one that's finished in 3 weeks. And then you have this beer. But yeah, totally. I'm in the same boat with you, right? Most of my fermentations with ale yeast are like 2 or 3 days.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the majority of the fermentation, but I would, to be safe, as rule of thumb, wait a week. Obviously, if you're monitoring fermentation in real time with a tilt or something, once you see that plateau and it's no longer decreasing, you're good to go. But I think as a general rule of thumb, once attenuation has finished and a standard strength ale that's not, 100 IBUs or not heavily dry hopped or not, getting a Brett secondary, etc. Once fermentation is complete, you can keg it. And then as long as you can get it clear, assuming that's the style of in question, it's ready to drink once it's cold and clear. So you could lager it for a week to help drop some of that out. You could use a fining agent like gelatin or biofine to force that. But once you're reasonably clear, you're ready. So you could reasonably be drinking a blonde ale in 2 weeks, grain to glass, 7-day fermentation, and then, cold crashing, fining, carbonation, and you're drinking it.
Right. I need to correct myself then, right? Because I just used fermentation to describe attenuation. and not maturation, right? At 2 to 3 days, let me be very clear, is the time it takes for attenuation to occur. Maybe 4 days, right? And maybe 5 days. It just depends sometimes on the yeast, but no more than 5 days generally with an ale yeast. That beer has fully attenuated, but all the other stuff that happens, like Jordan said, can take several days, right? You might be able to crank out a beer in, 7 or 8, 9 days, especially if you're using something like Kvike, but most of the time it's going to take about 2 weeks. And that's kind of what I totally agree with Jordan there. In my experience, what I'll do is let the yeast ferment out. And if I'm just making a blonde ale or something that's not getting a dry hop addition or anything, let that yeast ferment out, which is usually after 3 or 4 days. It's totally done. And then I'll usually let it sit for another at least 5 days, if not a week afterwards. And usually for me, by that point, everything is cleaned up. The beer is nice and clear, especially if I'm using finings, right? I'll add finings at that last point, right? So if I'm letting it sit, it's fermented for 3 or 4 days. I let it sit for another 5 or a week, but it's in that 5 day or 1 week. That's when I add my finings right before cold crashing. And so I'll let my finings, add those finings, and then cold crash, drop the beer down, from fermentation temperature, 66 Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, down to 0, essentially. 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll drop it all the way down there and add my finings. And so that's kind of, the beer is mature at that point. So I know it's ready. I know it's done. I just need to do a little bit of what I call chemical maturation. And that's just making the beer clear. I could crash it and then just let it sit for another, 2 weeks or a month or so. And all of those things that would drop out with finings will drop out, and I'll have a nice, beautiful, crystal clear beer. But that's kind of my general ale fermentation. So again, I'm producing an ale within 2 weeks, which is pretty darn fast for making a beer, if you think about it.
Clarification. Are you adding your finings in cold beer or pre-cold crash warm beer? And what's your method there?
I'm adding my findings in cold crash warm beer. Sometimes, and if I'm using gelatin, I'm usually not using gelatin. I'm usually using something like Biofine because my wife is vegetarian, so I usually don't use gelatin. If gelatin, I'll start the crashing and usually crash to 50 or 55 or something, and a 55 Fahrenheit. So what is that, 12 or 14 Celsius? Crash to that point and then add the gelatin, because I've heard, you don't want to add gelatin at room temperature. I don't know if that's actually true, but I'm usually adding it to warm beer that's then going to cold crash. I'm usually not adding my findings to cold beer.
And I'm not a Biofine user. Does Biofine care what temperature the beer's at? I mean, obviously not boiling beer or wort for that matter, but does Biofine work in both cold and room temp applications? Is there a industry preference there?
That's a great question. I don't know.
But it works for you, huh?
It works for me, yeah, and it makes clear beer. That's how I've always used Biofine, is just at that, pitch it right whenever you crash. I pitch the Biofine in, and along with usually some potassium metabisulfite a little bit too, just in the fermenter, because I like to clean up any oxygen that might still be left in there. But I'll pitch that in and then hit the temperature controller to crash. And it'll crash within a few hours, right? In a 5-gallon fermenter, it's going to crash down to 32 degrees in 6 to 8 hours. I mean, it's not going to take long for it to crash it down.
Okay.
That crashing happens really fast.
So we've talked about standard strength, kind of, quote, boring ales. Let's now maybe shift to hoppy
boring ales.
No, I love.
We know what Jordan's preferences are.
No. I love cream ale. But and maybe we can talk a second about hybrid ales too in a second. But I think that once dry hops come into the picture, there's a little bit of added complexity and some considerations when it comes to maturation. So I think that basically what we've just described, if you're then going to dry hop the beer, dry hoppings come next. Dry hopping comes next, but before carbonation, effectively, right? So you might dry hop cold, you might dry hop warm, but the things that we described versus passing VDK and finishing attenuation, generally speaking, people are dry hopping after that stuff has happened. Obviously, you can dry hop mid-fermentation at yeast pitch, but if that's the case, then you're still waiting for attenuation to complete anyway. So when it comes to dry hopping, I think that you do need a little bit more time. I think that cold crashing is really good practice when it comes to dry hopping if you're dry hopping at room temp, because we do not want hop particulates in the glass of beer that's being served. And so it also seems that dry hopped beer, it needs a few extra days. There's this whole kind of misnomer about IPA needs to be drank fresh. And although that's true, there is a caveat there, is that like it needs a couple days to kind of fall out of suspension before it's like a really enjoyable, consumable product. And so basically at the end of the day, when it comes to a dry hop beer, I'd add a couple days at minimum, maybe even a week of cold, quote, lagering time onto your brew schedule before that's going to start pouring really nice and like more rounded and pure, because you need that hop like bit particulates to fall out of solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's two concepts there that you've talked about, right? One is a concept that we talk about in Science World called hop creep, right? I mean, you guys have talked about that. You've probably heard of it as well. That's one thing. And then the other thing is this idea that, like you said, that you have to drink IPA like on the day that it's ready, right? And on the day that it's finished its attenuation, get it out of there because it's going to start going bag in the keg. On the latter one, right? This idea that you have to drink IPA fresh. That's true, but it's IPA that's been exposed to oxygen. And at the end of fermentation, there's very little oxygen that's left at the end of fermentation. It's either blown off through the fermentation itself or it's been used by the yeast. So there's very little oxygen in a closed system. So the beer, even exposed to hops, isn't, I mean, if you leave it for a while, yeah, certain things can happen, but it's the exposure of oxygen that's the problem. So at the end of fermentation, the beer is great. It can sit there. Even an IPA can sit there and probably not lose a whole lot of flavor or anything else. But but this hop creep thing is a big deal, right? And it depends on the amount of hops that you add. The hop creep, the whole idea is when you add dry hops to it, enzymes that are present on the hops, either from the plant itself or from microbes that are on the hops, those enzymes release sugars that then the yeast that's still in your fermenter can ferment. But those yeast have already started to go to sleep. They've already started to hibernate. And so they're not ready to ferment sugars. It's like, I gotta wait. It's like, to use John Palmer's analogy about the workday, right? You finished all your work and you've cleaned up your desk and you're walking out the door, and then your boss or somebody says, hey, I've got 2 more things I need you to process. Can you go process these things? But you're late and you got to get home to whatever you got to get home to. And you're like, crap, okay, I'll process this, but I'm going to just do it as fast as I can. And I'm going to leave a bunch of crap on my desk, right? Because I got to go. The day's over. And so you leave the diacetyl. So that's a problem that some brewers have, especially with huge dry hop charges, is that diacetyl sticks around. And if you don't give the yeast the additional time it needs to clean up that diacetyl, you're going to have a diacetyl bomb. If you try to dry hop in a bottle or something, which people have tried to do, that's going to create a diacetyl bomb. So you don't want to do that. So yeah, so like I said, my traditional ale, if I'm just doing a blonde ale, right, that's maybe around 10 days I can go into the bottle or the keg, right, and package. With a dry hopped beer, I'm going to extend that out to a full 2 weeks, and I'm probably not going to package an IPA within 2 weeks because I want to give it the time that it has to clean up everything. And like you said, I want it to drop out those hoppy compounds because I don't want hop burn in my beer. So, IPAs and hops are an interesting thing. But again, hops were added to beer originally to preserve it and for freshness. So don't lose sight of that whenever you're trying to get your fresh IPA into the beer. It's going to maintain some of the freshness of the beer.
Right. And so maybe to recap that. So my preference when it comes to dry hopping for an IPA, I am trying to mitigate oxygen at all costs. So I dry hop in kegs with floating dip tubes with filters on them. So I'm pushing non-foaming sanitizer out of the keg so then it's completely evacuated of oxygen. I'm adding my dry hop, opening the port, adding the loose dry hops, closing it, purging it 5 times to then, try to get rid of anything I just exposed by opening it. And I'm close transferring beer into this. I'm letting it sit at room temperature for 1 or 2 days. I will taste it to make sure I'm not getting crazy levels of diacetyl on the tongue. And I will also take a gravity measurement to make sure that the gravity of the dry hopped beer is at least as low as it was before the dry hops were added. I am also nowadays at my dry hop charge adding a half dropper or full dropper full of ALDC to prevent any hop creep and diacetyl formation. So the big thing here is that we want to make sure that we're giving it sufficient time to pass the dry hop creep phase. Then we're cold crashing, and then we're transferring off the hops into a keg. And I think a lot of brewers have found success that hoppy beer, dry hop beer, really benefits from like a week of cold conditioning to kind of round out the flavors. So collectively, we're adding another 7 days or so to the process.
Yeah, and one other thing that's sort of difficult sometimes about hoppy beers is, for me, hoppy beers are usually higher strength in alcohol. So I think this is a good segue into one of the other big yeast stressors, which is whenever you're making a beer that is high alcohol, right? And so for me, too, when I'm making a beer that's a high strength, like a high strength ale, for example, I'm also going to let that have a little bit of extra time to, quote, mature, right? To clean up some of those flavors, because it's a stressful condition. Even if you're pitching the right amounts, even if you're oxygenating, all that, you make a stressful condition for beer or for the yeast when you're brewing high strength ales. Do you do anything like extended maturation times with higher strength ales?
Yeah, we could probably spend an entire episode talking about how to make strong, big, barrel-aged imperial stout, because to put this in perspective, the thick boys these days are finishing at gravities higher than the starting gravities of many ales and lagers. So finishing at 1060, finishing at 1080, and starting at 33, 40 Plato. Like, these are numbers that are so high that the measurement devices that we have no longer measure that high. And so I took a class, an online class with Corey King of Side Project, who makes incredible strong beers. And he had some interesting tips that I never would have thought about. So obviously your pitch rate is, through the roof, and, mind your pitch rates there when making beers that are starting at 35 Plato. But falling fermentation, which interestingly finishes in a similar amount of time, I assumed that, if it's 4 times the sugars of a standard strength ale, that'd be 4 times the fermentation time. It's not. So it finishes in a kind of a similar time, but what he recommends is actually lagering your imperial stout for like 6 weeks before it goes into barrels. And the protein or whatever load of a beer that's 33 Plato is insane. And after a 6 weeks lagering phase, there are handfuls and handfuls of like gunk. It almost looks like kombucha SCOBY that fall out of solution during a lagering phase prior to going into barrel. And if you're, barrel aging this stuff, which is a whole nother world of maturation, this is keeping that gunk out of your barrels and preserving your barrels. So with super strong gravity beers like barley wines and imperial stouts, there is actually benefit to lagering them to get all that stuff out of solution before you go into your next maturation phase, which is a room temperature maturation, which could be 6 months to maybe 2 years, maybe in a barrel, maybe using wood cubes or something like that. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, but turns out that lagering prior to room temp maturation for super big beers is a nice little trick.
Yeah, that's a really interesting tip. And I mean, that makes a lot of sense too, right? I've gotten emails from people before asking about like, they brewed this giant beer with huge strength, right? 10, 11, 12% beer, whatever. And they have no foam on it. They have like no head on it. And so I'm wondering if it's because there's just all this gunk in there, like in the beer itself, the CO2 or whatever, there's just not enough foam that's built. That maturation phase may drop out a bunch of those proteins and stuff, or like things that are causing foam not to happen, like, fatty acids or things like that. That's really interesting though, to think about maturing the beer before you put it into a barrel. That's something I'm going to have to try the next time I make a strong beer. Really interesting.
Well, yeah, the thing is, those brew days, they're brutal, It's like a standard strength beer is like 10, 15 pounds of 5 gallons. For 5 gallons, 10, 15 pounds of grain. The the one time I did this, it was 85 pounds of grain. To make, and I still used sugar and I still used DME to hit 5 gallons of 33 Plato wort. Now, there was 10 gallons of, 1050 runoff that I was able to make Irish stout out of or whatever. So, but you're boiling for hours. You have to do all these mashes to get the volume. It's a brutal brew day. And, if you're using 8 times the amount of grain that ultimately is going in the same glass, not surprising that foam is a problem. I mean, this stuff is thick.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally thick. And I mean, the alcohol is going to cause a problem too, for that stuff as well. But yeah, I mean, all kinds of problems with that. But again, to get to back to the maturation thing, I mean, it's so cool to think about like using, letting those things drop out, after a 6-week fermentation. But there's 2 other categories that I don't want to forget, and we have to talk about, right? We got to talk about lagers, and then I want to talk about what you mentioned earlier, like secondary fermentation, so sour, Brett beers, barrel-aged beers, that sort of stuff. So let's start with lagers first, and you sort of being a lager purist or traditionalist, I'll let you go first on what your, traditional lager maturation is.
Sure. So we talked about attenuation. We talked about passing VDK. So we've passed VDK. I will typically do a diacetyl rest. So I'm going to be the beer is now fermented and ready to transition into lagering phase, and I'm typically about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So I will typically do a slow ramp down. I believe that Brülosophy has done experiments and found that didn't have a perceivable impact. I have cold crashed without problem, but I often have the time to spare, so why not do a slower ramp down? I do 3 degrees in the morning and then 3 degrees at night on my temp controller. That's a trick I learned from Jamil Zainasheff. So I'm slowly ramping down to lagering temp, and I'll want to get down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even 31, about 0 C. And then I will, at this point, I'm still in primary. And so once I hit 0C or 32F, I will then do a closed transfer into a purge Cade, like I described previously, to get it off the yeast. So this is something that really confused me when I was a new lager brewer, is they say, and Palmer talked about this in the episode that you had with him last week, that it's important for the maturation to occur in the presence of yeast. And so as a new home brewer, I was like, oh, okay, so you make your lager and then you put the carboy in the fridge and you let it sit in your fridge for 3 months on the yeast cake. And in fact, that's not the way to do it, because assuming you're not like crazy complicatedly filtering your beer with like filter media or something like that en route to your secondary lagering vessel, there is still yeast in suspension, despite it sitting at 0 Celsius, even for a week. There is still sufficient yeast cells in suspension, even though it's fairly clear, to achieve that lagering phase in your secondary without the entire yeast cake being present. And so the rule of thumb is a week per degree Plato of original gravity. A 12 Plato beer would be 12 weeks of lagering time. I've found that 3 weeks is pretty good. And for a lot of styles, like 6 weeks, you're totally there. And part of it is like, are we using aids? So are we using fining agents to drop that out of solution? So when you're lagering, I would recommend not filtering it in the path to lagering. You want that little bit of yeast in suspension. Let that fall out naturally in the lagering phase. And then at the end, when you're ready to serve, that's when you add your finings. Because, and I don't know if we should do an experiment on this, but my fear is if I fine on like the day I transition to the lagering tank, that I've dropped all that yeast out of suspension and it's no longer doing its job of cleaning up during that extended lagering phase. So that's why I always add my finings like after the 4 weeks of lagering or whatever, then I, put it into the kegerator and I'm good to go. I will note that I use floating dip tubes because you are going to have some muck that falls out of solution during your lagering phase. And I don't want to transfer to yet a third keg and risk introduction of oxygen. So I will use floating dip tubes in my lagering/serving kegs. So, because I'm also transferring it from a lagering chamber to a kegerator that's right next to it. So when you lift it up, you're going to get, some stuff to kind of flare up into solution. So that's why I'll add my gelatin then, because I know that that's going to, flare up into solution, but the gelatin is positively or negatively charged or whatever, and we'll bring that all back down. So then in a few days, even the jostling, it's crystal clear and being served on draft.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, too, you're adding that gelatin under closed transfer. And you've talked about that on prior episodes of this show and also the Brülosophy podcast about your method for adding gelatin. So you're doing that under closed transfer, not to expose it to oxygen. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it sounds super complicated to me. But you make fantastic lagers. I've had some of your lagers and I know they're incredible. I mean, of course, you won the Osh Body, right? Oregon State Homebrewer of the Year on lagers amongst all the other styles that you brewed. I don't do all of that for lagering. And I think this is, again, where you get to have what you want as a brewer, right? You get to do what you want. I will say, as I get older, my lagering times are extending. All right. So maybe in a few years, I'll be doing more traditional process like you're doing, Jordan. But for me, I'm generally fermenting all of my lagers warm. Although I will say that's yeast dependent, right? So I generally use Harvest whenever I'm fermenting a lager. Like that's Imperial's Harvest. That's just a strain that I really like. It makes a really nice, clean lager beer every time I brew with it. And so I generally ferment it around 66C or around, 20 Celsius or maybe a little bit higher than 20 Celsius, something around that range. And I'm fermenting quickly. I will do a VDK rest, not necessarily raising the temperature, like you're probably doing, is raising the temperature. But I will do, some time for VDK to clean up. I'll taste the beer, make sure I don't taste any diacetyl or butter. And then I'll cold crash. And I'll cold crash it down to cold, add my findings immediately, and then serve it almost exactly like I would do an ale. And to me, there's still a flavor difference, right, between ales and lagers. Those ale yeasts are just more fruity. They're throwing off a little bit more flavors, more esters than the lager yeasts. And I don't have this problem with sulfur that I feel like a lot of people have whenever they're lager brewing. And maybe that's just Harvest. It could be another strain of yeast that people are using that have like high sulfur. I mean, I guess maybe you know something about that.
I think this is actually a really good way to talk about hybrid ales as well, because effectively you're brewing a hybrid ale. You're
that's true.
Using a lager yeast. You're fermenting it warmer than it's supposed to be. On the flip, and this is like a classic debate in cream ale. Do you use a lager yeast and ferment it warmer, or do you use an ale yeast and ferment it cooler? Right. Those are kind of the two popular approaches to fermenting a cream ale. But hybrid beers are things like Kolsch, alt beer, cream ale, and it's where we're, fermenting ale strains maybe at like 60 degrees Fahrenheit, or fermenting maybe a lager strain at like 60 degrees Fahrenheit instead of an ale at 68 or a lager strain at like 48, right? And so when we've talked about this before, but when you are fermenting with sulfur producing strains like Harvest at warmer temperatures, you're not getting the same kind of sulfur in solution. Is it because it's blowing it all off due to the more vigorous fermentation? Is it not making as much to begin with? I'm not sure, but to me, it kind of doesn't matter because there's less there. And so when fermenting lagers warm, you don't need to lager them as long because there's less crap that you need to volatilize off. And they're just kind of, they ferment quicker and they mature quicker, right? And so I think that for a rule of thumb, when it comes to hybrid beers, be it fermenting lagers warm or making Kolsch with like a German ale strain like Imperial's Dieter and fermenting at 60, you can cut your lagering time in like half. Right. So if you're normally lagering for 6 weeks, you can get away with 3 and it's pretty darn clean because there's just the fermentation was not nearly as stressed as a cold lager fermentation, and you just don't need as much time. But I do think that it is a folly to not lager your Kolsch even like a little bit, Give it a couple weeks. It really benefits from stuff falling out of solution and kind of just becomes rounder and crisper. And so I do think that with the hybrid ale approach, a little bit of lagering time works. And I will say that I've been messing around a little bit with worm fermented lager, and it keeps coming back to tasting like Kolsch to me. And so,
so I love Kolsch. So
yeah. And so
I'm like,
people
this
that are
is great.
fermenting lagers warm, it's not wrong. It's just different. And I like Kolsch a lot, and so I'm kind of okay with that. But I also really like cold fermented lager, and so it's like I can like apples and oranges.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Right. I mean, there are so many different ways to brew beer and drink great beer. And so again, no one way is the right way or the perfect way. It's whatever is important to you, for sure. I always want to say that and be very clear about that. Yeah. But it's interesting talking about lager beers, the different approaches to lager beers and having a clean, crisp beer. I mean, we've talked about lagers a bunch of time on the show, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about that, because I do want to mention sour beers, Brett beers, and for that matter, a barrel-aged beers, but this idea of secondary fermented beers. So beers that are going to spend a long period of time on something other than just brewer's yeast, or in a container that's not just the primary fermenter. And when I say a long time, I mean like they're going to be in there for months. We're not talking about we're not talking about a few weeks or a month or something like that. We're talking about these beers are going to be in a secondary container for a very long time.
Right. So when we talk about sour beers, we're talking about traditional mixed fermentation beers. Kettle sours do not require long maturation times. So there are kind of two primary approaches to mixed fermentation production, a staggered approach or a simultaneous co-pitch, right? So for a simultaneous co-pitch, which is my preference for sour beers, I'm adding my sack, my PDO, my lacto, and my Brett all on the brew day, and just put it away in the corner and wait, 6 months to a year, and then come back to it then. But another approach, and this is my preferred approach for Brett beers, is you do your primary sack fermentation clean, and then you rack to a secondary off the sack yeast cake, and you add your Brettanomyces. That is the best way to get a more nuanced Brett character. It's kind of hard to describe unless you've done it, but there is a different taste between a Brett secondary and a Brett primary. Brett primary, first off, doesn't attenuate as much. It acts like it's sack, and we'll finish at 10-10 or something like that, 2 Plato, 3 Plato. But when you add Brett at secondary, if your secondary, you're starting at 10-10, 2 or 3 Plato, that Brett will then consume sugars that are left over in the secondary fermentation that it wouldn't have if it was added as the primary fermenting agent. And so this secondary fermentation is actually doing something, right? And so in the case of microbes, if you do a staggered approach where you ferment clean, and then you're adding your microbes like PDO, lacto, and Brett perhaps as well. And you always want to add Brett with PDO because of PDO's diacetyl production. And Brett cleans up the PDO's diacetyl. It's acidifying. And then further attenuating via the Brett. And so it's taking those residual sugars and converting them into lactic acid and so on and so forth. And so that really takes time. And so I would, for a Brett beer, maybe 3 months for secondary fermentation to occur. Maybe you'd be done as quick as 6 weeks, but it's not the most predictable organism in the world. And then for acidification with lacto and PDO in this traditional sour beer approach, give it 6 months. Now, if we're talking spontaneous fermentation, that really needs about a year before it's approachable. And then with sour beers, especially spontaneous beers, you can experience bottle shock in the bottle. So then you need that tertiary fermentation. And what's the fourth fermentation if you did a tertiary on fruit?
I don't know. Quaternary fermentation?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And so if you do a tertiary fermentation on fruit, 6 weeks is a good rule of thumb. There's some different opinions on different fruits and what they need. But then when you go into package, assuming you're bottling these things and using bottling sugar, sour beers can actually experience a bottle shock. And there's a couple things that can happen. One is you could get sick in the bottle where it becomes ropey from the PDO, and the Brett will eventually clean that up and it'll start to pour clear again, or not viscous again. But also, the lambics that I've made using traditional spontaneous fermentation, they don't taste good in the bottle, like after 2 weeks of like carbonation with the re-fermentation in the bottle. They need like 6 months, like to a year before they like turn the corner. And so American sour beers where you're pitching lab cultures, after 2 weeks, it might be good. It might need a month or so, but spontaneous beers really need time in the bottle. So we're talking years for these things to get ready. Between 1 year of spontaneous fermentation, the classic Goose blend is a blend of 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year old stock. And then you might need to wait another 6 months in the bottle before it actually starts to taste good, let alone carbonate. If you're using a traditional Goose method of blending in young beer is the carbonating agent. So, sour beer is like the epitome of mature beer.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's certainly like the most expansive look at mature beer, right? Because you got so much time and so many things happen in a sour beer. I mean, I was talking to a group of students in the beer class at OSU here a couple of weeks ago, talking about sour beers, and we were trying like kettle sours and then trying like some American sours that had been aged in a barrel for a year or two, and just talking about the different complexity. And it's really interesting to think about. If you get the chance, or Google this, look at a fermentation colony count, like an organism count over time. And it's super cool to see. If you look at like within like a few days or a few weeks, Saccharomyces is intended to reproduce very quickly so that it can its job, or it's the thing that it's really good at, is in the presence of sugars reproducing and then converting those sugars into alcohol and CO2 for energy. It's super good at that. It's really good at that. The cool thing about Brettanomyces is really good at eating a lot of different things. Like I kind of think of Brettanomyces as like a little trash compactor that kind of just comes along and just like eats the thing that's in front of it. And it's amazing. It's able to switch its metabolism in a whole bunch of different ways, which are really cool. Doing a deep dive on Brettanomyces is something I want to do on this show. But you mentioned like diacetyl, right? You mentioned pitching Pediococcus with Brettanomyces because the PDO is going to do its thing. PDO is a lactic acid bacteria, so it's going to produce sour. It's going to produce lactic acid, but it's also going to produce diacetyl. And diacetyl in the presence of lactic acid just kind of tastes weird and tastes gross. But Brettanomyces is going to eat that diacetyl. So it's going to take the diacetyl and use it, right, in its cell, which is really cool. Brettanomyces does that with a bunch of things, a bunch of different flavor compounds. It's able to metabolize a lot of different resources to generate energy to continue chugging along. So if you look at a fermentation curve, the Saccharomyces is going to start low and it's going to go up really high. It's going to spike, maybe to like 10 to the 9 or 10 to the 10th. And then it's going to drop down after like 3 or 4 days to nothing. I mean, it's just going to settle out and essentially go into hibernation or die. The Brettanomyces isn't going to do a thing for like 4 or 5 or 6 months. And then suddenly the Brettanomyces is going to pick up and it's going to be the dominant culture in the beer. Like lactic acid can do both. Like lactic acid bacteria like Pediococcus and like lactobacillus can actually generate a huge amount of biomass really quickly and then drop off. But they can also last for a long time too. They can survive for a long time in low pH beers especially. So you can see like lacto and pedio might flare up like Saccharomyces and then die away, but then might come back over like a year or two and might have a high cell count. Looking at a fermentation curve is just like, especially of sour beers, it's just this like mind-blowing experience because like, wow, look at all these different things. And if you taste through the beers at those different maturation points, you will taste a different beer. But this is, again, the highest paid person in a Belgian brewery and a Belgian lambic brewery is not the brewmaster, right? That person is just a guy that makes wort at the end of the day. The highest paid person in a Belgian brewery that's making goose and lambics is the blender, the person that's tasting through all of the different barrels and going, okay, this one and this one and this one, and this is what we're going to put together. And I mean, even you, Jordan, have talked about your sour ale blending, mixing up. It's kind of like a little bit of mad scientist. Like you've got this little thing and you're going to blend in a little bit of that, blend a little bit of this, taste it. And then, okay, I've got my percentages. All right, now I'm going to make several bottles of this and package it. I mean, all of that is all sensory, and that maturation of that beer isn't even done until it's blended, right? So you might have waited 3 years and have this beer, but you're not just bottling off that beer, you're blending it with another couple of beers. So this whole maturation process is just super fluid when it comes to sour beers and Brett beers and even anything barrel aged, right? That's not just sour and Brett, that's barrel aged beers too, because the flavors are going to change over time. There's oxygen that micro ingresses. There are microbes present in the barrel. There are flavors from the barrel that are going to leach out at different points. All of these things come into play. And like you said, we could do probably 5 episodes just talking about, secondary fermentation in like sour and barrel aged beers.
Right. And so maybe to wrap up, we can talk about non-sour barrel-aged beers. I will say that I'm not an expert in this. I did have a 5-gallon barrel that I started making sour beer in. I maybe immediately. I don't know if I ever did a clean turn in it. And so I had some experience making sour beer in it. And I've found that it's not necessary at the homebrew scale. You can just use carboys or whatever at the homebrew scale for for sour mixed fermentation sour beer. But if you want to make a barrel aged imperial stout, there is definitely an allure that's associated with using a real barrel. It's something I'd like to mess around with again at the homebrew scale because I have never achieved that big barrel character from soaking, wood cubes and bourbon or something like that. But I know it can be done, and it's something I'd like to get better at. But on the flip side, there's some concerns around surface area exposure for these 5-gallon barrels. The amount of beer that's physically touching the wood is dramatically higher than a 30 or 50-gallon barrel or something like that. So the rule of thumb is, I heard this recently. It's something like the number of gallons is the number of months in which you want to age it in there. So a 2.5-gallon barrel, you would age 2.5 months. I hope I'm remembering that right. Versus like a 50-gallon barrel, which would be like 50 months, right? And so when aging your barley wines and your imperial stouts in a barrel, you want to be very mindful of your oxygen exposure. So some micro-oxygenation is happening via the barrel breathing and stuff. And so that's adding to some of that rounding and quote staling of the flavors that's acceptable in things like old ales, but you don't want to go too far. You don't want it to turn to vinegar, and you don't want it to become like wet cardboard. And so one thing that you'll often hear brewers talk about is topping off. So you have the angel share, right? And the beer that's fermented, and maybe like the recommendation we gave earlier, is even lagered prior to going into the barrel, is going to evaporate off, and you're going to start to create headspace at the top of the barrel. And we do not want these beers to get overly oxidized, let alone infected. So some brewers will then top off and every 6 months, 3 months, whatever, add a little bit more beer so that the barrel is completely full. I think that generally speaking, beers are being aged in like bourbon barrels for 6 months to 2 years. And you might even hear things like double barreling where they'll transfer from one barrel to another. But again, not something I have a ton of experience with at the homebrew scale, but I gather blending is really important here. And these things are kind of unpredictable, and you might get more extraction in one barrel compared to the barrel it's sitting next to. So having barrel stock to draw from is really important when making a enjoyable bourbon barrel aged stout or barley wine or something like that, because this maturation process will pull spirit character into your beer, and some are going to get oxidized and some are going to get infected, and so you really got to be careful and just not blindly start adding all your barrels into your blend, because you might get some stinkers in there.
Yeah, I mean, this last discussion of sour beers and then beers that are aged in barrels that aren't sour makes me think that we need a couple more Brew Lab episodes on this topic, right? I mean, there's certainly a lot that we need to talk about, and I don't really have anything to add in terms of sour or barrel aging non-sour beers because I don't have much experience with it. I mean, my only experiences are barrel aging sour beers, and even that's limited. So, I go with those tips and tricks that Jordan's just shared. And if you have any other questions, shoot me an email. Maybe I can find a guest to do an episode on this topic. Well, Jordan, we have talked a lot about beer maturation, and hopefully you got some things out of this, listeners, in what you're looking for in terms of finding things or learning more about beer maturation and determining when the beer is done. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Jordan, about maturation?
Slow beer is the best beer. Take your time.
Slow beer is good beer. I don't know if it's necessarily the best beer, but I'm certainly, as I get older, am definitely taking more time with the beer. I think John might agree with you, though, Jordan.
Well, and the other trick I'll add at the end here is it is very tempting to drink your lager before it's ready. The best remedy I've found is to brew more. You got to brew so much lager that you have wonderful fresh kegs that you're enjoying on draft, so you don't even care about what's sitting in your lagering chamber. You know?
Yeah. That's right. Brew more often. All right. Well, I'll leave it there. Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.